And so we begin once again tonight with the babies. Where are the babies? We still don't know. Where are their parents? The Trump government arrested over 3,000 children and babies at the southern border before the president announced a change in that policy last week. And today, according to Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar, there are still 2,047 migrant children in federal custody after being separated from their parents. Secretary Azar was scheduled to testify at a Senate Finance Committee hearing on the urgent issue of prescription drug prices today, but the top Democrat on the Finance Committee, Ron Wyden, wanted to talk about something even more urgent.
How many have been reunified?
So they would be unified with either parents or other relatives under our policy. So, of course, if the parent remains in detention, unfortunately, under rules that are set by Congress and the courts, they can't be reunified while they're in detention.
So is the answer zero? I mean,
we've had hundreds of children who had been separated who are now with, for instance, if there was another parent who's here in the country.
I want to know about the children in your department's custody. How many of them have been reunified?
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. They have been placed with a parent or other relative who's here in the United States.
How many?
Several hundred.
Of the
2,300 plus that came into our care, we only have 2047.
2047. Okay. So that means so far this week, Health and Human Services have helped in some unknown way exactly 6 children. Because this weekend, Health and Human Services Department said that they had 2,053 migrant children in custody. This morning, the secretary said they had only 6. Less than that, 2,047. Today, 17 states and the District of Columbia asked a federal judge to bar the Trump administration from separating children and their parents who cross the southern border. The Washington Post reports that the state attorneys general are, quote, asserting in a lawsuit that the practice was an affront to states' sovereign interests in enforcing their laws governing minimum standards of care for children. Leading up our discussion now, Jacob Soboroff, MSNBC correspondent, and Hilarie Bass, president of the American Bar Association. She observed immigration court proceedings today in McAllen, Texas, and met with parents separated from their children in Port Isabel. Jacob, your assessment of what you heard from the Secretary of Human Services today and what it means about what's going on the southern border.
Well, we don't know, Lawrence, if 6 is actually the right number of children reunited by HHS. We had an absolutely bizarre press conference call with HHS today where Lisa Desjardins from the PBS NewsHour asked repeatedly 3 times in a row of HHS officials, are you still receiving separated kids? And HHS refused 3 times in a row to answer that question. So we don't know if 6 means those are the only number of kids who have been reunited. We don't know if they are actually receiving new children and more children are being reunited than only 6. But Lawrence, I just want to read you something I got in my email 30 seconds before we went on the air. This is new from HHS. They're confirming to me that we receive separated kids when there is credible jeopardy or criminality. So yes, we will still receive separated kids. This is not the circumstance under which the Trump administration was separating children, but HHS has just confirmed to me separated kids are still coming in, which is why there's some confusion with the number of kids they still have in their custody. They say it's 2,047 as of tonight.
So, Jacob, just to clarify, even if the Trump policy has been stopped, even if they've stopped doing that, there would still be, in the normal course of business as there was in the past, some separated children at the border if the parent is found to have a criminal record that indicates that that parent needs to be separated from the child or some other reason.
That's exactly right. And so that's what they are telling me tonight. Another fascinating thing that we heard on this call is that number, 522 kids who have been reunited so far. It was confirmed again to us tonight that number of children that have been reunited were not actually reunited by HHS. They were reunited by CBP. So that means the number, again, of children reunited with their parents that were taken away from their parents by this policy may be only a handful by HHS. They may not have reunited any, as far as we know, until we get this number sorted out with the children that are still being separated coming in, versus the children that are going out. Still so many questions that they haven't answered.
And Hilarie Bass, reunited is being used now, but it doesn't necessarily mean reunited with a parent. In some cases, they're talking about having these children go to some other relative in the United States.
That's correct, Lawrence. And we also spoke to a number of women today who indicated that they had provided information about sponsors in the U.S. for their separated children. One had a husband who was documented and lived in the United States, and she indicated from the first day that she was brought into detention, she informed them that she had a husband in the United States and that her children should be given to the husband. And yet, despite that, after 4 weeks of being in detention, there's been no effort to reunite the children with their father. So there are all kinds of stories that we heard today that really reflect the lack of transparency in this process. These women who are in detention, many of them have not heard from their children. They don't know where their children are, and no one is telling them what the process will be to allow them to be reunified. Some went so far as to tell us, we know we have legitimate asylum claims. We would give it all up if you will just return us to our children. And that's a scary thought, because that would seem to indicate that people with legitimate bases to be in the United States legally are going to give up those rights just to be prevented, just so that they can be back with their children.
We have a graphic on the bottom of the screen, HHS, 2,047 separated children still in custody. I would respectfully submit it should say HHS says 2,047 separated children still in custody, because, Hilarie Bass, we don't know. As Jacob Soboroff just said, we can't trust the numbers coming out. We can report what they say and attribute to them that they have said it. But Hilarie Bass, how will we, is there a legal way? Do lawyers have a strategy for trying to amass case data from around the country and figure out an independent source of real numbers?
Well, as I told these sobbing women today, American lawyers will not rest until every one of them is reunified with their children. And so we are seeking volunteer attorneys, both to represent the parents in South Texas, as well as the children in whatever city in the United States they are, to evaluate their legal claims and to ensure that there is someone who will be their advocate, to do everything possible to ensure that they will be reunified with their parents.
What did you see in immigration court today? Does it look like a changed policy is in place?
Immigration court, there were 75 people, each of which got to spend about 2 minutes with the public defender to tell them the rights they were waiving by virtue of going through this criminal process and admitting guilt for having illegally crossed the border. But mind you, this is a direct result of a zero-tolerance policy. Previously, many of these people would have been immediately deported if they didn't have a basis for an asylum claim without going through this kangaroo court of 75 people walking in and raising their right hand and all saying, yes, they were guilty of illegally crossing the border.
Jacob
it didn't
Soboroff,
accomplish anything.
Jacob, do we have a total? Do we have a real total number? Because the media has been using this number, 2,000, low end of the 2,000s. That was a June 9th number. And the policy went on for another 2 weeks after that. Have the federal government ever released a total number of children who they separated?
No, and actually, Lawrence, it's not just on the back end, it's on the front end as well. You know, we have been told that policy, before it was announced, was sort of unofficially in place. Parents were getting separated from their children for the simple act of the misdemeanor of crossing over the border before the official policy actually was enacted. And I just want to say something about what you said earlier about independent verification. I spent the day I'm back in Los Angeles. I spent the day on the phone here with immigrants' rights groups on the ground. I think the biggest Central American population in the country, if I'm not mistaken, is here in Los Angeles. And those groups are not able to independently verify the numbers of separated children that are on the ground in ORR facilities here, even the ones that have their numbers on the wall in those facilities in order for those immigrants to be able to make a call to those groups if they need them. That is all still being worked out here on the back end by the groups that are supposed to be the ones looking out for these folks.
And Hilarie Bass, at what point might these parents lose their parental rights and lose their children to an adoption process that they cannot control?
The big concern is that these parents get deported while their children are in some distant city. And since we have reason to believe that these records are not accurate, some of those children may have been identified as unaccompanied when in fact they were accompanied with a parent, but they were separated at the border. And it's unclear that any of the documentation that the government bureaucracies currently have is accurate in really telling us which parent goes with which child.
And Jacob, when I was in Texas, I saw a sheet handed out by local community organizers who were trying to track this. And the sheet indicated the kind of children who they believe were held at various facilities, the name of the facility, and it would say boys, ages 12 to 17, something like that, or girls. Has the government handed out any official document of that kind and indicated where it within that kind of outline where babies, infant babies and nursing babies are?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, the only way, or one of the only ways we're able to try to suss out where folks are, who they are, and how old they are is through the local jurisdictions responsible for licensing these operations. And just like the Texas Department of Public Health, had issued the license to operate Casa Padre, the giant shelter that I went into that was in a former Walmart with 1,500 boys. For instance, if there is one of those shelters or more of them here in the city or the county of Los Angeles, the county or the city health department or some other department would have to license those facilities to operate. So if you really want to figure it out, you basically have to call up all of these local jurisdictions, see what these facilities are licensed for, and then dig deeper based on that limited information we're able to get at this point.
Well, some observers told me at Casa Presidente, for example, in Brownsville, that they saw diapers. They saw a large delivery of diapers going in, and they believed that they saw soiled diapers coming out. And that's the kind of evidence they're working with down there, trying to piece this together. Jacob Soboroff, Hilarie Bass, thank you both very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.